Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, let me just remind you, actually, we are expecting to hear from Donald Trump shortly, so we will go straight to him in Poland as soon as he starts to speak. I think it's still... Oh, in fact, he's speaking right now. Let's listen in.
Hospitality, we've had a wonderful stay. It's been quick, but the people of Poland have been so fantastic. And as you know, Polish Americans came out in droves. They voted in the last election. And I was very happy with that result. So I just want to thank you, and I want to thank them. It's a true honor to be here in Poland. It's a majestic nation. It really is. It's a spectacular place, some of the most beautiful sights that we just saw coming over, really very inspirational. You're rich in history, and you have absolutely an unbreakable spirit. That's something we've learned for over the course of many years. The President and I concluded a productive meeting in which we reaffirmed our enduring bonds of friendship and have united our citizens for a long time. But we've never been closer to Poland, I think, than we are right now. Poland is not only a great friend, but a truly important ally and a partner with respect to our military. We've had great cooperations with Poland. We fought shoulder to shoulder in many different encounters. Particularly grateful for the active role Poland has taken in helping to defeat ISIS, where we've made tremendous strides, tremendous gains, which you'll be hearing about over the next period of time, and other terrorist organizations. Poland's been right there with us by training Iraqi special forces and flying reconnaissance missions, and just about any time we requested, they were there. Brave Polish soldiers have fought and worked side by side with Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan. And on behalf of all Americans, I want to salute you. I want to thank you. Very, very special people. I also want to thank the Polish people for their kindness to more than 5,000 American troops that are stationed in your country. Our strong alliance with Poland and NATO remains critical to deterring conflict and ensuring that war between great powers never again ravages Europe, and that the world will be a safer and better place. America is committed to maintaining peace and security in Central and Eastern Europe. We're working with Poland in response to Russia's actions and destabilizing behavior. And we're grateful for the example Poland has set for every member of the NATO alliance by being one of the few nations that actually meets its financial obligations. As you know, I've been pretty hard on some of the members of NATO for not, and the money is pouring in, I can tell you. I was criticized, Mr. President, but I can also say that the people at NATO aren't criticizing me. They're very happy. The money has been pouring in the last year, far greater than it ever would have been. It is past time for all countries and all countries in the NATO alliance to get going and to get up to their obligations. But I can say that Poland has been right there, and you will even exceed that number, and I appreciate that very much, and so do a lot of other countries. During our meeting, I congratulated President Duda on Poland's recent election to the United Nations Security Council. We also discussed our mutual commitment to safeguarding the values at the heart of our alliance: freedom, sovereignty, and the rule of law. Poland joins the Security Council at a very critical time. It's a critical time, frankly, for the world, because you see what's going on. Not only must we secure our nations from the threat of terrorism, but we must also confront the threat from North Korea. And that's what it is. It's a threat. And we will confront it very strongly. President Duda and I call on all nations to confront this global threat and publicly demonstrate to North Korea that there are consequences for their very, very bad behavior. We also discussed the ongoing humanitarian catastrophe in Syria and the need to defeat ISIS and other terrorist groups where they control territory and populations. We have fought very hard and very powerfully against ISIS since I've been president, and we've made tremendous gains, far greater than has ever been made with respect to that group. While the cities of Raqqa and Mosul will soon be liberated from these murderers, criminals, and butchers, we recognize that Syria requires a political solution that does not advance Iran's destructive agenda and does not allow terrorist organizations to return. We also reaffirm that any nation that values human life can never tolerate the use of chemical weapons, and we won't tolerate it either. Finally, we agreed to work to expand commerce between our countries. We strongly support the 3 Cs initiative, and America stands ready to help Poland and other European nations diversify their energy supplies so that you can never be held hostage to a single supplier, or as we sometimes call it, a monopoly. I'm pleased to report that the first shipment of American liquefied natural gas arrived in Poland last month, and there'll be many more coming. Maybe we can get your price up a little bit, but that's okay. He's a tough negotiator. We look forward to making the economic ties between the United States and Poland even stronger through trading relationships, and that is a balanced and reciprocal one. We want reciprocal trade relationships. We don't have too many of them. I said before that the United States has made some of the worst trade deals ever in history. That's going to change. That's going to change. The friendship between our peoples dates all the way back to the American Revolution. It's a long time. I look forward to speaking more about these enduring bonds of faith and freedom when I address the entire Polish nation in just a little while. I hear we have a big crowd, Mr. President. It's going to be a big, I think they're showing up for you, not for me, right? We're going to have a big crowd. That's what the word is. So, President Duda, thank you again for welcoming Melania and myself to your beloved homeland. Together, we can make the partnership between our 2 nations stronger than ever before. Special people, special place, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dziękuję, panie prezydencie. Teraz mamy czas na 4 pytania
Thank you, Mr. President. Now we have time to take 4 questions, 2 from each side. Let us start with a guest from the United States. Is there any question from the U.S. side?
David?
Thank you, Mr. President. In light of North Korea's latest ICBM testing, do you think they're beyond redemption, or is there a chance they might actually make a U-turn? And are you willing and ready to launch military action against them? and if I may, I have to ask about this. Since you started the whole wrestling video thing, what are your thoughts about what has happened since then? I mean, CNN went after you and has threatened to expose the identity of a person they said was responsible for it. I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think what CNN did was unfortunate for them. As you know now, they have some pretty serious problems. They have been fake news for a long time. They've been covering me in a very dishonest way. Do you have that also, by the way, Mr. President? But CNN and others, I mean, not others. NBC is equally as bad, despite the fact that I made them a fortune with The Apprentice, but they forgot that. But I will say that CNN has really taken it too seriously, and I think they've hurt themselves very badly, very, very badly. And what we want to see in the United States is honest, beautiful, free, but honest press. We want to see fair press. I think it's a very important thing. We don't want fake news. And by the way, not everybody is fake news, but we don't want fake news. Bad thing, very bad for our country. As far as North Korea is concerned, I don't know. We'll see what happens. I don't like to talk about what I have planned, but I have some pretty severe things that we're thinking about. That doesn't mean we're going to do them. I don't draw red lines. President Obama drew a red line, and I was the one that made it look a little bit better than it was, but that could have been done a lot sooner, and you wouldn't have had the same situation that you have right now in Syria. That was a big mistake. But I think we'll just take a look at what happens over the coming weeks and months with respect to North Korea. It's a shame that they're behaving this way, but they are behaving in a very, very dangerous manner, and something will have to be done about it. Thank you. Thank you, David.
And Mr. President, since we're speaking about press freedoms, your party has significantly clamped down on press freedoms in the last year and now appears to be weakening the power of the national courts as well. Do you think that people who live in other modern democracies, including some Americans, are wrong to criticize you for limiting which reporters can cover the parliament?
Szanowny Panie, odpowiadając na to pytanie.
So to respond to your question, sir, media order is a very significant thing indeed. And when we look at the situation in the United States, when we look at the situation in Poland, in every case you can see a lot of pathologies. I can give you an example of one of Polish magazines, which compared two TV channels of two different broadcasters. And as an example, one of those broadcasters did not report about my visit to Croatia, the visit of the President of the Republic of Poland to Croatia, a very important one, which was preparing the Three Seas Summit, because this broadcaster does not really like me as the President of Poland. So I'm permanently criticized by that broadcaster. But I believe this is just the reality. This is the right of the media. In Poland, we've got an absolute liberty and freedom of the media. Problems were there during previous governments. Also, when the former president was in office, when one of the magazines, the Prost magazine, was visited by special services in order to take away recordings which were compromising for the politicians of the previous ruling party. So that was when the freedom was under threat. But now we have got absolute freedom of the media. We do respect the freedom of the media. We do take care of the interests of the Republic of Poland and of Polish people. Thank you, Mr. President. Now the question from the Polish side. The first question, Polish television.
Jedno pytanie.
One question, please.
Dzień dobry, Miłosz Kłoczek,
Miłosz
Telewizja
Kłoczek,
Polska.
I represent the Polish television. One question concerning energy, because both of you mentioned energy sector and the deliveries of LNG. So my first question goes to President Trump. In what time perspective do you think a permanent contract could be entered into to ensure LNG gas deliveries, American deliveries to Poland? And the question to President Duda. Could Poland become a certain hub for the transportation of American gas, a hub to Three Seas countries?
A very fair question. I think we can enter a contract for LNG within the next 15 minutes. Do you have anybody available to negotiate? It will take about 15 minutes. You know, we're becoming a great exporter of energy. Very soon we'll be a very great exporter of energy, and we've taken a lot of unnecessary regulations out of our process, and we are doing things that we haven't been able to do for a long time. So we're blessed with great land. We didn't even know it 15 years ago in terms of what was underneath our feet, and certainly we have found out through technology that we are truly blessed to have this incredible wealth under our feet. And we are going to be an exporter of energy. It's already happening, and anytime you're ready, we can do additional contracts. We've already done the one, but we can do many additional contracts. Thank you.
Szanowni Państwo, no, ja mogę odpowiedzieć tylko tak.
I can give you the following answer. It is not the President of the United States and the President of Poland who are going to sign the long-term contract for LNG gas deliveries to Poland. But the contract will be signed by companies, by a Polish company and an American company, and this is how it will be proceeded. What is most important, however, the most important thing is that there is green light given by the U.S. government, by the U.S. administration, that there is an incentive given by Americans for us to buy gas from the United States. And on our side, on the Polish side, on the side of the Polish authorities, there is also this green light, and there is interest in this particular thing. So I count that after relevant negotiations, I know that those negotiations are already ongoing. I believe that after the conclusion of those negotiations, there will be a long-term contract for U.S. LNG deliveries to our LNG terminal in Świnoujście. And answering the second part of your question, can we become a hub through which gas, LNG gas, American gas will flow to Central Europe? I am convinced that the answer is yes. I'm convinced that the answer is yes, and today we are going to talk about this also under the framework of the 3Cs initiative. This is also connected with the establishment of an energy corridor, of a gas corridor along the north-south axis. But also in the future, this could ensure perhaps alternative supplies vis-à-vis Russian supplies, alternative supplies for Ukraine. This is of primary importance, and this is what we discussed today with Mr. President Trump. I'm convinced that the future is very rosy on this one, very bright, and the contracts will be entered into. And of course, we on our part, according to the needs, are going to develop our capacities as regards the reception of the LNG gas from the US and from other directions. Media is free in Poland. So now the question from a private broadcaster, TVN. Mr. Vrona, thank you very much. Question to both presidents. You mentioned military cooperation. I would like to find out from both of you, presidents, whether during your exchange, were there any concrete guarantees extended concerning the presence of American troops in Poland as long as there is threat from the Russian side? And how do you see the future, presidents, the future of the presence of American troops in Poland?
Well, we didn't discuss guarantees, and we weren't really in that position to discuss guarantees, but certainly we've been here for a long time. We have quite a few troops here, up to 5,000, and we will continue to do that, and we will continue to work with Poland, but we did not discuss guarantees, no.
Panie redaktorze, rozmawialiśmy z panem prezydentem przede wszystkim o
with Mr.
sytuacji.
President, the topic that we discussed first and foremost was the security situation that we have here. We discussed in the context of what is happening in our part of Europe, in the context of the Zapad 17 maneuvers, which we have already mentioned. And from that point of view, there is no doubt that the presence of American troops and NATO troops in Poland today is absolutely justified from this perspective. If we add to this the situation that we are seeing in Ukraine all the time, then it is absolutely clear. But we are going to discuss it further with Mr. President. We made an initial agreement to meet next year in the White House. We agreed that I will pay a visit to the United States next year. Of course, the details will be worked out later on, but that year is important both for us Poles and for the Polish Americans, because next year we are going to celebrate the centennial of Poland's regaining of independence. And I would like myself and Mr. President to stress together the importance of that year, because this shows the contribution of the Polish people to the welfare of the United States over the last 100 years. And the last question, American media, very briefly, please, because the presidents have got to attend the 3C summit in a minute. So perhaps Mr. President Trump is going to select the next journalist asking the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. To you first, a two-part question, if I may. Will you once and for all, yes or no, definitively say that Russia interfered in the 2016 election?
Well, I think it was Russia, and I think it could have been other people in other countries. Could have been a lot of people interfered. I said it very simply. I think it could very well have been Russia, but I think it could well have been other countries, and I won't be specific, but I think a lot of people interfere. I think it's been happening for a long time. It's been happening for many, many years. Now, the thing I have to mention is that Barack Obama, when he was president, found out about this in terms of if it were Russia, found out about it in August. Now, the election was in November. That's a lot of time. He did nothing about it. Why did he do nothing about it? He was told it was Russia by the CIA, as I understand it. It was well reported. And he did nothing about it. They say he choked. Well, I don't think he choked. I think what happened is he thought Hillary Clinton was going to win the election, and he said, let's not do anything about it. Had he thought the other way, he would have done something about it. So he was told in early August by presumably the CIA that Russia was trying to get involved or meddling pretty strongly with the election. He did nothing about it. The reason is he thought Hillary was going to win. And if he thought I was going to win, he would have done plenty about it. So that's the real question, is why did he do nothing from August all the way to November 8th? Why did he do nothing? His people said he choked. I don't think he choked.
So the follow-ups for you on that, Mr. President, you again say you think it was Russia. Your intelligence agencies have been far more definitive. They say it was Russia. Why won't you agree with them and say it was?
Well, I'll tell you, let me just start off by saying, I heard it was 17 agencies. I said, boy, that's a lot. Do we even have that many intelligence agencies, right? Let's check it. And we did some very heavy research. It turned out to be 3 or 4. It wasn't 17. And many of your compatriots had to change their reporting, and they had to apologize, and they had to correct. Now, with that being said, mistakes have been made. I agree. I think it was Russia, but I think it was probably other people and/or countries, and I see nothing wrong with that statement. Nobody really knows. Nobody really knows for sure. I remember when I was sitting back listening about Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, how everybody was 100% sure that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And guess what? That led to one big mess. They were wrong, and it led to a mess. So it was Russia, and I think it was probably others also, and that's been going on for a long period of time. But my big question is, why did Obama do nothing about it from August all the way to November 8th? He did nothing about it, and it wasn't because he choked.
And before I get to President Duda, you talk about being angry at President Obama, Mr. President.
Thank you very much.
About having anger.
Thank you very much. We must go.
Very briefly follow up, Mr.
Thank
President.
you very much.
Why haven't you shown that anger toward Moscow,
It was 2 questions. Thank you very much.
Oh, can I ask of President Duda,
Dziękuję
please?
panom prezydentom, dziękuję
President Duda.
członkom delegacji, dziękuję państwu.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, bit of a battle of wills going on
Thank
there
you,
at the end with the number of questions, the limit reached, and the reporter still trying to ask another question. But the particularly interesting comments from Donald Trump related to North Korea, because the world is watching, of course, after that latest missile launch from North Korea, as to what the president's America's action might be, what might be the rest of the world's reaction. He said there that he was asked if he's willing and ready to launch military action against North Korea. He said, we'll see what happens over the coming weeks. I've some pretty severe things we're thinking about, but I don't like to talk about what I might do. They are behaving in a very dangerous manner, and something will have to be done about it, but I don't draw red lines. OK, that's Donald Trump in Poland.
President Trump has called on people in the West to stand up for their values, warning about the threats of terrorism and extremism. Speaking during a visit to Poland, he said the fundamental question of our times was whether the West had the will to survive. He's just arrived in Germany ahead of the G20 summit, as our diplomatic correspondent James Landale reports.
This memorial in the heart of Warsaw records one of the bloodiest moments in Poland's history, the uprising against the Nazis, in which hundreds of thousands died. Donald Trump came to this revered site to argue that Poland's resistance then should stand as an example to Western nations now, as they fight against Islamist extremism that he claimed poses a dire threat to our security and way of life.
The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have the confidence in our values to defend them at any cost? Do we have enough respect for our citizens to protect our borders? Do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert and destroy it?
He defined that civilization as the shared values of freedom and sovereignty and the bonds of culture and faith, a view supported by Poland's nationalist government that bussed in some of the crowd from outside the city to guarantee a warm welcome. This is why Donald Trump has come to Poland, a cheering crowd, a sympathetic crowd. He couldn't be guaranteed this in other European countries. But Mr. Trump also came here to meet America's allies on NATO's eastern flank, to reassure them for the first time on European soil that the United States would live up to the NATO Charter and come to their aid if they were attacked.
The United States has demonstrated, not merely with words, but with its actions, that we stand firmly behind Article 5, the mutual defense commitment.
This speech, though, was not just for the audience here in Poland. Mr. Trump warned North Korea of pretty severe action after its latest ballistic missile test. And he told Russia to stop destabilizing Ukraine, a deliberately tough message before his meeting with President Putin tomorrow. Then it was on to Germany for the G20 summit, where the president will receive a less warm welcome from protesters and political leaders alike, whose definition of civilization is perhaps different to his. James Landale, BBC News, Warsaw.
Gushing with praise for the Poles, delivering his strongest commitment yet to NATO, and even managing a chiding for Russia. Donald Trump has left his hosts in Poland very happy. But now he's landed in Germany for the G20 and faces a very different reception from world leaders and protesters on the streets. The big focus now, his pending one-on-one meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris has this.
It's a sound he never tires of. Admirers in Warsaw's Krzyzewski Square, many reportedly bussed in for the moment, chanted the American president's name. Through bulletproof glass, his wife cast President Trump as a champion of freedom.
People should be able to live their lives without fear, no matter what country they live in.
The America First leader drew inspiration from the Polish uprising against the Nazis to urge another uprising by the Christian-tinged West against a terrorism born of what he calls radical Islam.
The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have the confidence in our values to defend them at any cost? Do we have enough respect for our citizens to protect our borders? Do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert and destroy it?
It was a speech loaded with ideology, written by the same nationalist advisor who crafted his American Carnage inauguration speech. Yes, President Trump gave a strong reassurance on the collective security provision that underpins NATO, so critical to the Poles, but not without poking nations like Germany, who he says need to pay their way.
Words are easy, but actions are what matters. And for its own protection, and you know this, everybody knows this, everybody has to know this, Europe must do more.
Due to meet the Russian president for the first time tomorrow, President Trump used uncharacteristically forceful language.
We urge Russia to cease its destabilizing activities in Ukraine and elsewhere, and its support for hostile regimes, including Syria and Iran.
But when he stood alongside the Polish president at a press conference, the Western values President Trump just called for a crusade to defend seemed to melt under the camera lights. Rather than champion the free press, he took aim again at the networks and addressed his latest social media dust-up with CNN.
CNN has really taken it too seriously, and I think they've hurt themselves very badly, very, very badly.
As for free and fair elections and the conclusion of 17 US intelligence agencies that Russia hacked the election he won, well, who can know for sure?
I agree. I think it was Russia, but I think it was probably other people and/or countries, and I see nothing wrong with that statement. Nobody really knows. Nobody really knows for sure.
Mr. President,
Thank you very much.
why haven't you shown that anger toward Moscow?
It was two questions.
NBC's Dear Lady wasn't allowed to finish, but provided a cue for protesters dressed in the scarlet cloaks of The Handmaid's Tale, gathered to show their enthusiasm for another Western value, undervalued, they would argue, by President Trump.
Seems to be some kind of international of misogynists and sexists.
By the time the president arrived in Hamburg this evening to meet with his political opposite, Angela Merkel, while this photo captures the awkwardness, thousands of protesters had gathered in the streets. But they're not chanting his name there, at least not in a good way.
And this is the scene now in Hamburg, where G20 protests called "Welcome to Hell" by demonstrators have turned violent. Well, I'm joined now by political scientist and president of risk consultancy Razor Group, Ian Bremmer. Ian Bremmer, let's just deal with the Putin meeting tomorrow. It's interesting that he sort of called on Russia to behave. That was one of his first sort of sayings on landing. How's this meeting really going to go, do you think?
Well, that was from a speech that he read but didn't write, where when he was actually taking a question, as you note, his response was very much aligned with what he's been saying, wants to be friendly with Russia. I think this meeting, I suspect his meeting with Putin will be the warmest of any of his bilaterals at the G20. And given just how distinct the national interests of these two countries are right now, I can say honestly, I don't think I've ever seen a time where the two heads of state have been more misaligned with where their countries are.
Well, that's extraordinary. I mean, what would that mean for dealing with North Korea, for dealing with Qatar, for dealing with the questions which actually do, in fact, probably worry both of them?
Well, I mean, it means that we don't have a lot of global leadership these days. I mean, the countries and the alliances are in a lot of flux. We know that the biggest issue that will be discussed by the leaders at the G20 will be amongst themselves, hey, how do you deal with Trump? I mean, the meetings I've had with heads of state and ministers of foreign affairs over the last 5 months have all oriented around their calls, their meetings with the American president and not knowing exactly what to make of it. And some of that is his unpredictability. Some of that is a feeling of untrustworthiness. Some of it is a feeling that they don't actually like the guy very much. He's now going to face this for the first time in the context of the G20 with all of these leaders around him. His personal relations with most of them are quite challenging, unusually so for the only global superpower in the world today.
Well, that leaves us with the NATO question, where he seems to have been rather more disposed towards NATO than he has been in the past. So does that mean that he's beginning to sort of accept he's going to bury the hatchet and recognise he's got some obligations in Europe?
I think so. I mean, we saw that already about a little over a week ago with the Romanian president. When Trump met with him, he accepted the validity of the collective defense clause, Article 5 in NATO, and he reiterated that more strongly with his speech in Poland today. He thinks because there have been an increase in a number of NATO members' defense spending towards and in some cases above the 2% commitment of GDP in spend, that he can paint this as a win. That Trump became president, they're spending more on NATO, I told you I was going to do something, I'm committed to these guys. That's very different, of course, than Trump's individual relationships with these leaders, where they don't think he's favorably disposed towards common values or free trade, and they don't think that he's committed to multilateral institutions, which for a leader like Angela Merkel is, you know, the basis of the relationship.
Ian Bremmer, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Something may have been lost in translation, but Donald Trump spent much of his presidential campaign proudly proclaiming that Vladimir Putin had described him as a genius. And this lofty regard was apparently mutual, with Trump regularly expressing his admiration of Putin's strength. Today, however, the American president seemed to place his Russian counterpart on the other side of a purported war against Western civilization. During a speech in the Polish capital, Warsaw, he called on Russia to stop destabilizing Ukraine and other countries and to end support for hostile regimes such as those in Syria and Iran. With the pair due to meet tomorrow at the G20 summit in Hamburg, Newsnight's diplomatic editor Mark Urban has been exploring the American president's apocalyptic warning.
It's the president's second trip to Europe, and today's speech was billed as a big foreign policy moment. Given in Warsaw's Krasinski Square in front of a memorial to the 1944 uprising against the Nazis, an appreciative audience had been brought in by the Polish government. It fell to the First Lady to do the warm-up.
The President of the United States, Donald J. Trump.
And with that, Trump set out his stall of a West in existential crisis and his formula for success amid these myriad threats.
While we will always welcome new citizens who share our values and love our people, our borders will always be closed to terrorism and extremism of any kind. Today, the West is also confronted by the powers that seek to test our will, undermine our confidence, and challenge our interests. To meet new forms of aggression, including propaganda, financial crimes, and cyber warfare, we must adapt our alliance to compete effectively in new ways
and on all new battlefields.
And here, having alluded to the Russian and Chinese threats, he did at last state his commitment to NATO's mutual defence provision, Article 5. But it was a distinctly Trumpian formula that shed little light on the issue of how the West revives its fortunes economically. Can it be done?
A large part of that, the answer to that question, depends upon whether Macron and Merkel can reignite the Franco-German motor, rewrite Europe's fiscal rules, and really generate growth again on the European continent. That's where the hope lies. And if you like, you know, the glass of champagne is half full at the moment in Paris and in Berlin.
Today's speech owes much to White House strategy boss Steve Bannon.
You have an expansionist Islam and you have an expansionist China, right? They are motivated, they're arrogant, they're on the march, and they think the Judeo-Christian West is on the retreat.
His view of the world revolves around hard power and the need for spiritual renewal in the West. Even so, many more mainstream conservatives welcomed today's address.
I think the president struck the right tone on Polish soil today, a strong reiteration, I think, of the broader transatlantic alliance and a reminder of the values that hold the West together.
The illiberality of this message and emphasis on religious faith worked well for this Polish audience, but it's out of kilter with much of Europe.
It was very significant, not only that he chose Poland, you know, which has got a law and justice government, a right-wing government, a very Christian government that refuses to take refugees from the Middle East and is being sued by the EU over that. But it's very significant that he, in his speech in Warsaw, did not use the word democracy once.
The president today claimed that billions and billions of extra defence spending were now pouring into NATO as a result of the pressure he'd put on allies. So typical transactional Trump. Having got what he wanted, he gave the Europeans what he thought they were after, the pledge on mutual defence. That's all very well, but it hardly builds Western unity. After today's Warsaw event, Hamburg looked very different this evening as the president arrived for a G20 meeting. Violent protests happened pre-Trump, of course, but in tone and substance, the president's message is hardly healing Western divisions.
I'm joined now by the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Eric Foner and Susan Glasser, a former foreign policy editor-in-chief and the first editor of Politico magazine. Susan, was it significant, do you think, or how significant was it that the word democracy didn't appear at all in that speech?
Well, I would say it's significant but not a surprise. Donald Trump doesn't use the word democracy very often. In fact, some people here were likening his speech today to a European version of his American Carnage inauguration speech. And I think, you know, as in that speech, which also did not really reference democracy, he's chosen to really take the clash of civilizations route rather than the restore and renew our democracy route.
And Eric Foner, the clash of the civilizations, sort of harking back to Samuel Huntington's 1993 work, where Islam replaces Russia as the enemy of Western domination in the world. Does that tally with what you heard today?
Well, yes. I think what was interesting was that Trump is laying out this very apocalyptic vision of the world divided into the forces of light, the forces of darkness, and it gives you insight into what you might call the intellectual origins of Trump's outlook. It may seem absurd to put intellectual and Trump in the same sentence because he doesn't read books, he has no intellectual curiosity, but as was said, people like Steve Bannon around him, his political advisor, this is their view of the world, and that it has always been these clashes of civilization. We're in a kind of that our whole civilization is under assault from either ISIS or, radical Islam, as they call it, or maybe the Chinese in the future rising. And, this is a view which is not particularly conducive to compromise, to negotiation. You know, Bannon seems to think we're living back in the age of the Crusades, where Christianity and Islam are at war and for the future of the world. You know, if you look at ISIS, it's ridiculous. This is a small group of violent, criminal people, but they don't pose a threat to the United States or the United Kingdom. I mean, in the Cold War, the future, the existence of these countries was under threat. You know, we had from nuclear warfare. But, you know, this apocalyptic vision is not really an accurate representation of the way the world is today.
And yet the rhetoric, Susan Glasser, of an assault upon Western values well, it puts bums on seats, doesn't it? Well, what values do you think he might realistically be able to persuade Americans are being threatened by a resurgent China or a supposedly expansionist Islam?
Well, you know, I think Professor Foner really nailed it on the head. It's very murky what exactly is the clash of civilizations here. And I think that's why Trump's speech today, by the way, is probably unlikely really to amount to much in terms of policy. I was struck by the fact that, you know who it reminds me of? It actually reminds me of Vladimir Putin's rhetoric. And I think you captured earlier in the program the tension between, on the one hand, this sort of critical language toward Russia that you haven't always seen Trump use. So he did chide them for their moves in Ukraine. He did suggest that they should stop shoring up Assad in Syria. But that seemed almost half-hearted compared with the sort of full-throated, bombastic, even rhetorical nature of this speech. And it's actually Vladimir Putin who often talks in terms very much like this. He says the #1 threat that Russia and Europe faces is from terrorism. He said that from the beginning of his tenure as Russia's leader. And then he talks about restoring conservative values like Trump, but in a very vague way. I think Trump was pretty unclear exactly what the existential threat is right now.
Do you think he knows himself, Eric Foner, what the existential threat is? Or am I right in thinking you're sort of casting him in the role of Steve Bannon's glove puppet?
Well, it's Bannon, what we call the alt-right in the United States. There's another kind of forebear of Trump. You didn't mention this, but in his speech he also spent time denouncing bureaucracy. Yes. Of course, nobody likes to defend bureaucracy, but you know, this goes back to an obscure writer called James Burnham, The Managerial Revolution, a book of the early 1940s, which has been picked up again by these kind of obscure right-wing websites to argue that really the threat today is not from violent Islam, but from just the administrative state. And, you know, Trump spends a lot of time attacking what they call the deep state, you know, regulation, all that kind of thing. And, you know, that's another trope that these extreme rightists are very fond of using, that it's the state itself which is the danger to Western freedoms.
Burnham, I think, contended that communism and capitalism were essentially two sides of the same undesirable coin. What word, I mean, something a little more sophisticated than Trumpism, but what word would you employ to describe whatever alternative it is that this lobby, the alt-right, Trump, Bannon, whoever, want to replace the old world order with?
It's ultimately the thing you didn't mention is that beneath this is a very exclusive vision of what American civilization or Western civilization is. It's fundamentally Christian, it's fundamentally white, and you know, other peoples really don't have a role in it according to them. And you know, you could call it a kind of white nationalism. That's what we often call it in the United States. And it's, you know, it's very explicit now, not in this speech, but in the right-wing websites and call-in radio. The racial element here and the religious element is very strong. And of course, that goes all the way against the traditions of American values of separation of church and state and pluralism and tolerance. Those are threats to our civilization right now, but they're coming from within.
Susan Glasser, the meeting with Putin tomorrow, I mean, dare you speculate on what a positive outcome might be?
Well, you know, first of all, I would caution people against thinking that this is this sort of definitive moment of confrontation when we're going to find out once and for all just what is the deal between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, or even find out what our policy is. We've just heard that there's only going to be Donald Trump and Rex Tillerson and their translators in the meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and President Putin himself. It's going to be an hour or less. Once you add the translation in, it amounts to more or less a short chat between two countries. So even if they are talking, as has been reported, about new moves to cooperate in Syria on anti-terrorism moves, can you imagine any major significant arrangement being agreed to in a half an hour or 40 minutes of conversation between these two? You know, remember.
Forgive me, I have to move on. Susan Glasser, Eric Foner, thank you so much for your time this evening.